talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I am Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff.
How are you doing?
I am sitting here in awe. Sitting here in awe of you. Presentation you gave today and a roadmap slide that you created with the sliders. I mean, come on. That was awe-inspiring, Jeff. So for everybody who's listening, I'm going to try and create a visualization. There was a Gantt chart type roadmap, and a couple of the projects on the roadmap were set on these sliders, arrows. You basically can move the project back and forth. I've never seen it done before, and it worked. You nailed it.
Well, I'm going to tell you right now, that is an extremely low bar. I'm happy that I hurdled it, but yeah, it was nothing special. It was basic PowerPoint, at least, for me, I guess. But thank you for that, I guess.
You just keep stepping it up. But I'm also in awe because we have a really great guest today. So why don't you go ahead and introduce him?
Yeah, so we were talking a little bit before we, clicked the record here button of kind of how to introduce him. I'm going to call him an Identity and Access Management Knight of the Old Republic. I'm going to reach back into my Star Wars there. Kind of an IAM Jedi. He's been around in the IAM space since '84, the year my beloved Chicago Bulls picked up Michael Jordan. And his name is Jackson Shaw. Welcome to the show, Jackson.
Wow, I have a new signature, I think, now. IAM Jedi. That is amazing. Thank you. Well, great to be here.
The thing was also, Jeff, just to qualify, you meant 1984, not the year 84.
This is correct, 1984. So I imagine Jackson walking around in long, brown, flowing robes like Obi-Wan, and somewhere in his hand is a FIDO token that glows, and he's getting all kinds of stuff done. So Jackson, how did you get into IAM?
Well, serendipity, I guess. My whole life I wanted to be a chemist. I had this dream from the time I was literally 5 years old, and went to the University of Ottawa in 1980. And my first quote science course I had to take as part of that was a course in Fortran. And I don't know what it did, but it flipped a switch. And I thought, wow, this computer science stuff is kind of cool. And ended up changing my major to computer science. And I worked at the University of Ottawa for a number of years, and then joined them full time, and spent some time as a application analyst, and then a systems analyst before I left. And one of my jobs as a systems analyst, when I walked in the door up in the mainframe, the mainframe days, boy, was, hey, we get all these students that come in every September, and why don't you figure out a way to create accounts for all these people, and just build something. And I said, okay, cool. So I went off and did that. And noticed I didn't use the word provision because that never existed back then. And I created this system to create all these accounts. And a few years later, off I went to another company, or I went to a private company, or sort of a government company actually, called the International Development Research Center. And that was in 1993. And I had two really interesting jobs when I got there. The first one was, can you convert us off these telex systems? And gosh, look that up if you guys don't know what it is. But can you get us off these telex system onto this new thing called email? So I did that, which was an amazing project, because when you talk about ROI, and we talk about that in this business and many businesses, we went from something around the range of $100,000 a month in telexes to literally $100 a month in email costs. So it was a huge cost savings for the company I was at. And then the second project was to figure out and install a local area networking system. And we chose a product called Banyan Vines. And back in the mid 80s, man, that was the cat's meow, the mid 90s. That was the cat's meow when it came to local area networking. And in fact, wide area networking, and they had a distributed directory system called Street Talk. So I learned a lot about directories and email. I had the pleasure of going to Singapore in the 90s, and Delhi, India, working on 9600 baud modems and doing directory synchronization and transferring binary files. and just learned a ton about it and started working with a little software company in Toronto called Zoomit Corporation. And the guys at Zoomit, a good friend of mine, later became a good friend of mine, Kim Cameron, I loved what they had done around Banyan Vines and helping with directory synchronization and email synchronization. And I decided to join them in 93 and worked with those guys. And Kim, such a great mind, we basically ended up selling the company to Microsoft in 99. And Kim stayed at Microsoft. He just retired. So he'd been there quite a long time, a luminary in what became the identity and access management business. And I joined Microsoft in the summer of 99, actually right about now in 1999, to help launch this product called Active Directory that nobody had heard of. And the folks that had heard of it thought it was, not going to scale, not going to be enterprise ready. And, fast forward to, 5-6 years later, but fast forward to today, and nobody has any of those doubts. So I helped launch Active Directory. I managed, I did product management for both the identity management product, which was the Zoomit product, and also worked with the security guys a lot, got involved in biometrics at Microsoft in the very old days. And after sort of launching 3 versions of Windows Server, realized that things weren't going to get any more interesting for me. And I left and I went with a small company called Vintella in Utah, who had basically built a pile of good software that integrated Unix, Linux, and Java systems with Active Directory for Kerberos single sign-on and really easy account management. And you get away from the whole aspect of having to synchronize things. Everything was just done by the Active Directory login in Kerberos. So if you disabled somebody on AD, they didn't have access to the Unix and Linux systems. I mean, that was brand new, earth-shattering kind of technology back then.
What a novel concept, right?
Yeah, what a novel concept. And we got acquired, 6 months later, again, this time of the year in 2005 by a company called Quest Software. And I worked for Quest in various incarnations for 13, 14 years. Got to acquire 13 or 14 companies in many different areas like XACML, privileged account management, web single sign-on. I mean, the list goes on. Built some amazing products, worked with some amazing people. And, we got bought by Dell. We got spun out by Dell. Went to Francisco Partners for a while. And, finally sort of got tired and took a break from them and went on to a security company, which first time I ever worked in a security company at Force Point. Had a great experience there and left them. And now I'm kind of in between things, realizing that I want to get back into IAM, but it's been a long road. The other thing I'll just mention is, when I joined Zoomit, I joined as their VP of sales, which, I had great personal skills. I think I still have great personal skills. I honestly talked to my wife. But, the funny thing was, it was such new technology that I spent all my time talking to customers typically about what was wrong, and they were telling me what was wrong about the software. So I got into product management, kind of as the guy who was speaking to the customers and being the voice of the customer and trying to rationalize with Kim, who ran engineering, what things should be built. So I ended up in product management through that, but the identity thing, a long kind of history of just working with some amazing companies and being at the right place at the right time and surrounding myself with smart people. I always tell people who are new, work with people that are smarter than you. Don't be afraid of being challenged. It helps to bring you up and helps you think about these things. And I just stayed in IAM except for a little break with security, which was thoroughly positive. But it's been, as I said to you guys the other day, I've been in this since, as I put it in quotes, Christ was a corporal. Long before we talked about something called identity and access management, and at Zoomit, we released this thing called Zoomit Via, which was a meta directory. That was kind of the start of the whole IAM business. We got acquired by Microsoft in June or July of that year. Burton Group had a Catalyst conference in Lake Tahoe, and Nick Nichols from Novell, good friend of mine, came out at that, and they released DirectXML. And to me, that was kind of the whole start of we might have been the catalyst, but but that conference, the Burton Group conference, in Lake Tahoe, I think was the start of IAM, and that would have been in 2005. So despite being in it before that, I think 2005 was really the year that IAM really came to the forefront.
That's funny because I got into IAM, I think it was around 2003. And my first, and I didn't even know what IAM was. I literally got into a project, had a bunch of applications I needed to pull together into one username password per person, and found out that there's this thing called identity and access management.
Yeah.
We wound up implementing Oblix.
Sure. Yeah.
It was, and unlike a lot of identity management projects at the time, it was ginormously successful. And so Oblix got purchased by Oracle.
Yes.
Oracle was like, hey, man, we want you to go around and say how great our software is. So we're going to send you to all these conferences. And I was like, all right. I mean, this is an opportunity to kind of develop my career. I never spoke at conferences and everything. And I was going to, I remember in 2006, I went to one called Digital ID World. And I got exposed to Kim Cameron's Laws of Identity, and it was a major hit. And what I really loved about the industry was that it was just like philosophical conversations about what is identity, what, and how should things be done. I mean, it wasn't all down the weeds of like our technology limitations at the time. Obviously, that's kind of the underpinning of where things were back 15 years ago, but it was also thinking about where are things going. And I mean, it was wide open spaces. I just love the idea that technology, within this space of, managing identities and managing access could become such a philosophical conversation.
It truly is amazing. I mean, you think of it now, I mean, any of us that do product management or are involved in IAM companies or in the business know that this is a multi-billion-dollar business. Well, it wasn't. It was $1 million business, and then a $2 million business, and then as you mentioned, Oblix and many other company names that folks have probably forgotten or never even heard of. Built this into something to solve a lot of customer problems, and still going on. But now it's easily a multi-billion-dollar market, and it all started back then. I mean, Netscape was really important in it. The conversion or the sea change around things like X400 and X500, which I was madly in love with, and that being surpassed by things like LDAP and TCP/IP back in the 90s, and what Tim Howes did at University of Michigan, for example, and then what Netscape picked up on. I mean, those were amazing, liminal moments in this business that changed things forever. I learned that, just because something's a standard doesn't mean that it actually solves problems that people want to pay money for. That was probably one of my early learnings from all that.
Here's a name from the past for you. So Gordon Eubanks was the CEO of Gordon Eubanks. Right? I haven't heard that name in a while, right?
Oh my God!
He came out to my office in New Jersey and took me and a couple of the folks from my company out to lunch and just talked about identity. And it was like, someone said later, like, that guy's a billionaire. Like he is really a successful guy within this space. And it's like, he was so down to earth, such a cool guy.
Yeah. Gordon and many other people back then, went on and sold companies or bought companies, and some of them I still hear of or run into every once in a while at a conference. But a lot of companies from back in that day at the start of this whole thing have long moved on. I mean, you mentioned Oblix, which was huge in its own right, and went on into Oracle. But many companies back there that were very important and intrinsic to what has become identity and access management and identity governance.
Yeah, there's so many stories in this, and based on your answer, I'm going to say, and this goes back to my theory that IAM chooses you don't choose IAM. So I think what I heard is that IAM chose you, and that puts another one into my column.
I would 100% agree with that. I mean, we could talk for hours on the topic, and I think someday I might sit down with some of my old colleagues and just try to think of all the old names of the companies that came and went and where folks went. But yeah, I think IAM chose a lot of the people at the start and probably chooses a lot of people now.
Mm-hmm. I know that's certainly how I fell into it too.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question around Active Directory. Being
Sure.
part of that initial rollout and knowing how prevalent it is, right? It's essentially the Kleenex of directories, right, for organizations these days. Was it? How was the product launch of Active Directory itself? Was it ready, or was it launched and you knew it was going to be a few years before it really kind of would hit, or did you think it was not going to hit at all?
Right. Well, look, I'll give you a little bit of history on that. First of all, I'm not going to say that Microsoft operated any differently than, some companies operated then and today, which is, you launch products before you're ready. You're forced into, a date-based release sometimes. And those things always have problems. And that, was at Microsoft or anywhere else. But, I mentioned that one of my first, things at IDRC was implementing Banyan Vines, and I got to, I just had such a wonderful time with Banyan. I became the president of the Association of Banyan Users Canada, and then a few years later, the president of the Associations of Banyan Users International, and had a great time doing that. And I met so many of the Banyan executives, including this guy named Jim Alchin. And that's Alchin, Aalchin. And Jim was the VP of engineering. And it was a few years later that there was this big crisis at Banyan because Jim was lured away by this guy named Bill Gates and brought in specifically to get NT and Active Directory and other things out the door, which he did. So when I went to Microsoft, I got to run into Bill. I got to run into Bill, but I got to do a couple of things with Jim. And Jim was one of the key guys behind Street Talk, and he understood directories and some of the issues around that. So I think between Jim and many of the other great people that I met there, Peter Houston and all the wonderful folks there. Of course, Kim was there, and he, I think, was instrumental, not just with Active Directory, but everything we did afterwards. It was interesting to launch it. I mean, the thing to me that I remember most was, first of all, it was launched with Windows 2000, which was an incredible event. In San Francisco, it was unbelievable. And then, with Active Directory, we had so many people back in 2000, 2001, 2002, and then the tide started to change. Large companies who were like, there's no way this can take the place of my Sun LDAP directory. I'm sorry, we can't rely on it. There's no way it can scale. I'll mention Washington Mutual because they're out of business now, but I remember doing a scalability test with Washington Mutual in Seattle where we scaled to 60 million users. We could never get Active Directory to fall over. In fact, what was falling over were the web servers in front of Active Directory that just couldn't handle the load. So we proved pretty quickly that it was scalable and geographically dispersible and the whole ball of wax around it. Were there problems? Of course, there were original problems. The security boundary and the global forest and all that kind of stuff that happened afterwards. But in all honesty, one of my big jobs was doing customer briefings, and I would get laughed out of customer briefings, and people just wouldn't believe that it would work. And here we are now, and it's the thing. Azure in some ways, or Azure Active Directory has supplanted it, but in some ways, but for many, many years, it just became de facto. So
I want to share a personal experience. So
sure.
I really wish I knew you back in like 97, because I was sitting there reading books and trying to figure out what is this TCP/IP? What is a Win server? Like, and I'd learn a little bit, but I think one of the things about being in IT or being in IAM is that you have to like to solve problems. And so yes. Once I found out, I don't understand that, I would just read, try to figure it out. I had a home network. I'd break things. I'd be up all night trying to fix them. But I went and got my MCSE plus internet in the NT4 space. So that's 9 exams. Mm-hmm. But I remember the first was NT Workstation, then NT Server, And half the questions on the exam were how to do things with NetWare printers and NetWare, how to connect to a NetWare server.
Right.
And so, but it was like getting a college degree at the end of it. It was like the market was just, everybody was starting to deploy Windows. And if you had your MCSE, I really had like no real world experience in the enterprise. And so I got my first gig with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation as a contractor.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss was a master CNE. For those who don't know, that's the NetWare certificate, the equivalent NetWare certification or Novell certification. And my boss, he had a lot of real world experience, and he just kind of was like, this Windows stuff is never going to happen. Well, look at it now.
Well, I think the problem with the launch was there wasn't that you didn't do a Friends video like you did for Windows 95 to get that out there.
Right. Well, that was one of the. I learned so much at Microsoft. Man, it was a tough place to work in those days, but I learned so much, and product launches were always amazing. You mentioned TCP/IP, and it brought back the memory of having to figure out which TCP/IP stack we wanted to buy for our computers. I mean, can you imagine you actually paid for TCP/IP back in the day?
Well, yeah, there was a time too when you would buy a computer and it was like you connect to AOL, and then nobody buys AOL anymore. But I do find it, hilarious when somebody gives you their email addresses at AOL.com. Like, wow, you must have had that email address for like 30 years.
Yeah.
And that was back when internet was by the hour. It wasn't internet, right? It was more like bulletin board systems like AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe, those sorts of things. And that's,
Yeah, if you grew up in the day and age and you knew what 300 baud was, or 1200 or 24 or 9600, or how your world seems so further expanded when you went from 24 to 9600 baud, then you definitely remember all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think one thing we've just proven that we are old.
I know.
But for the folks who had enough history lesson, Jackson, where do you see things going? I mean, what's the next big thing?
Oh wow, next big thing.
In IAM.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking specifically about IAM. Well, I've been giving it a lot of thought over the last little bit. I mean, I've been off work for now about a month, and I've been thinking a little bit about it. But also before that, thinking about a number of different things that have been changing. And I'll mention a couple things. One is I still cannot get over the fact that we haven't solved the password problem. We keep talking about it. Companies
passwords are still a problem.
Yeah, they're still a problem, and companies.
I thought they died.
Companies come out and talk about how they've solved it, but the fact of the matter is, I think it's still a huge problem. I do believe, just to segue into a couple topics, I do think that what Apple has done around biometrics and facial recognition and tying things into Face ID and Touch ID is incredible. I think the fact that Apple signed on to FIDO2 and web authentication and Safari, I think is also amazing and going to really help with that. Not that other folks aren't doing similar things, but you need someone who's a market maker, and Apple is a market maker. They legitimized biometrics. So I'm really hoping that what they do in FIDO is going to help us with passwords. So I'm thinking, that's a great thing. I love what FIDO stands for, but I just can't tell you how many problems. I have a desk full, and I am not kidding. Last week, I got 2 FIDO authentication tokens from 2 different companies, neither of which I could get to work properly. Neither of which I could get integrated properly with all the programs I was working with, except for one particular program. So this whole aspect of physical tokens really is a downer. I think the biometric aspect I love. So I'm just supremely hopeful that Apple continues down the road and helps solve some of these problems. I use Apple in my whole life except for my desktop, and I think I mentioned to you guys the other day that I was thinking of getting a MacBook of some nature, and maybe that's sort of the future of the password. The other thing that I had this discussion a while ago. We were talking about ITSM. Which for most folks is in today's age is ServiceNow, but before it was things like BMC and Remedy. where ITSM is typically the last mile for IAM. So for something that you can't manage through some kind of a program, send it off to the ITSM thing and say, Jackson needs his badge, ship him a badge or whatever, and it goes through workflows and approvals and all that kind of stuff. And the thing I've been thinking about recently is, if this statement, and I do truly believe it, that 99 out of 100 RFPs ask for ITSM integration, and based on some research I've done recently, that from a cloud perspective, 95% of all of these things are talking to ServiceNow from an ITSM perspective, if it's a cloud-based ITSM. I start thinking to myself, okay, so you've got 95% of all these implementations are going to ServiceNow, and you start doing some research on ServiceNow, which totally blew me away because I didn't know anything about them. They've got a whole platform called the Now platform. So my brain goes to, what if instead of ending IAM at ITSM, we start IAM at ITSM? Because the Now platform has got connectivity capability, it's got protocol capabilities, it's got now has things like AI and ML, and some of these other concepts that many IAM and IGA companies are working on. Maybe things can start with ITSM. And what I was saying earlier about things like ServiceNow or Remedy is they're all workflows. They're all taking tasks, doing something with them, getting them approved, routing them, having folks click the button that they're done, go on to the next person, et cetera. They've got a huge history around that and a huge capability around that, which in a lot of ways, if you think about IAM and you think about identity governance, a lot of that is about workflow and approvals. So part of me is wondering if ITSM is the place to start IAM instead of the place to end IAM. And that's why I'm very interested in there's a company a friend of mine is CEO of presently called Clear Sky, and that's with the E on the end of sky. I think they're doing some really interesting stuff. I've done a little bit of work with them. So I think that's just a very, very interesting area for me. The whole biometrics thing I think is really interesting, and how that helps solve the password problem. If those two things, I think we have a long way to go. Like, when I started in this, I remember sitting down with Kim and Andy Ball, who was our CEO at Zoomit, and talking about how do we get partners involved in our product. And the discussion degraded into this: we have to make the product hard and difficult to implement if we want partners to help push our product, because they make their money on the services side. And it was just the opposite of what I was what I felt we should be trying to achieve. And this is back in the 90s. I'm thinking about, the ease of use and what then we never talked about customer experience, but what became customer experience and user experience. So one of my biggest, issues I still have from day one when I got into this business is how costly it is to get these systems implemented. I've seen many companies who over this 35 year period have like a tide change. They had CA, they rolled it out. They brought in IBM, they rolled it out. They brought in Microsoft, they rolled it out. They brought in somebody else. And I mean, it's not hard to come across a company that's done 4 different implementations over 10 years, 12 years, what have you, throwing it out for various different reasons. And I would love to see that change. I would love to see IAM get built in a way that's, in the way, I think about this in my brain, and I'm going to write a blog post about it, is like riding a bike. You get on your bike, you learn how to ride the bike, and then when you go to a 3-speed or a 10-speed or a 21-speed or a racing bike, you still know how to ride the bike. So why can't we build a system, or why can't we base something on a system where you get on in the basics like workflow and creating connectors and doing approvals and doing governance reports and things like that are all just part and parcel of riding that particular bike. And you go over to the next bike, and guess what? All those things are still there, the same flavor. You might get a few added things, 9-speed instead of 3-speed, but basically the concept of riding the bike is still there. And that's one of the biggest problems I think right now I'd love to see solved. And there are companies, Clear Sky is one of them, but there are companies that are thinking about this. How do you make this easy for a company to implement. And when I look at practitioners like yourself and myself, I mean, learn something once. Like, one of the biggest problems today is you start off with, let's say One Identity, the company I used to work at. You start off with their product. You need to find a One Identity partner and One Identity consultants, people who understand One Identity. And if that company throws out One Identity at some point for some valid reason, or maybe an invalid reason, but either way, and they bring in, let's say, Oracle's identity product, you got to go out and find Oracle people and Oracle partners, and you got to train all your people internally on Oracle. They got to forget what they learned about One Identity. That just horrifies me to this day. And I just, as I'm sort of nearing the end of my career, and trying to figure out, which companies and how we could sort of get closer to making this more like riding a bike. And maybe in the next generation, we'll get to that point.
Yeah, I see things like low code and no code, right? That's kind of where I see things are going. It used to be customization versus configuration, but even configuration was still code, right? It was some JavaScript or HTML or CSS, right, to get things the way you want them. But I see things like low code, no code. There's Skim that's out there, which really kind of only addresses kind of cloud as a standard. But it would be nice to have, identity management as Lego bricks, right? And you're reusing some of the same Lego bricks and concepts throughout to be able to do different things, right? Whether it's one product or another.
Exactly.
I want to say that it does seem to me that a lot of solutions that gain a lot of popularity start out simple, that they're very intuitive. And the two that jump to mind are Okta and SailPoint. And what happens over time is that companies want to take over more and more of the market share. So they try to take on the harder use cases and the advanced features. And that's where the products start getting very complex. And that's where companies, I mean, there are more companies out there that need IAM than there are IAM experts. And then you have the few IAM experts that generally get into consulting because they want to do this full time and et cetera, working for a consulting firm. I can speak from experiences. It has this obvious benefits. Companies ultimately end up with software that, if they just want to do the very basic use cases, they could probably figure out how to do it on their own. But then to do the more advanced stuff, I mean, Jeff and I we've worked with, a dozen companies a year or more. And, so we worked with a company last year and they had like 100 mainframes. That's totally different than most of the other companies that we work with. And, a lot of the IAM solution vendors want to get into that company, and they have to, have their product be able to work with that crazy legacy environment or whatever you might find. And that's, to me, that is where like Oracle, CA, and IBM, if we go back to that history discussion back in like the, mid 2000, that decade, they were trying to be heterogeneous. We work the best in the heterogeneous environment. We support RACF and Active Directory integration and network integration. There's nothing you can find, Lotus Domino integration. There's nothing you can find that we can't integrate to. Well, to do that requires complexity. And then when you insert complexity into your product, it necessarily makes it harder to deploy. And then somebody comes along like Okta and says, all we do is SAML single sign-on. And some companies are like, that's all we need. And other companies are start to say, well, we would love to get the benefits of being on something simpler. We're going to change our application. We're going to change our IT footprint to work with that. And so that's how the market kind of picks the winners and losers, because I think when things start to get too complex, then something simpler comes along, and the market wants simple. It wants elegant. It wants something that they can manage themselves.
Yeah, but even with the two companies you mentioned, both of which I know lots of people at, but Okta or SailPoint, if you're an Okta expert, your skills aren't going to transform to being a SailPoint expert, except at the very basics of what is an identity and what are some of the issues around identities, like email addresses and passwords and authentication and stuff like that. But if somebody wants to move from SailPoint to something else, there are a lot of issues involved, and the partners you worked with aren't necessarily the partners that are going to help you with the new company, and your staff have to all be retrained, and your operational procedures are all different. And what I'm trying to get to, or what I'm trying to think of, or believe, is that we get to a point where folks are using a platform that they already know how to operate and run on a day-to-day basis. They already know how to customize, and their end users are already familiar with it. And I think, back to your point about Lego and reusability, I mean, we get to that point, I think we'll be in a much better place. I mean, things can be complicated, but if you can reuse skills and your people are familiar with it, and you can have citizen developers, right? This low code, no code thing has been leading to this term called citizen developers. I think that's when our industry will get to go through a change. I mean, there will always be the companies, like you mentioned, that have 300 mainframes and are going to be tough to work with. There's no question that we're going to have that. But I just personally believe 85% of the companies probably could be have their IAM and IGA problems solved by something a little bit more basic, and that's what I would like to hope that we can still strive for and achieve someday.
Yeah, the challenge I see a lot of times is companies, and maybe even teams or business units within companies, think they're special, and they're not really. I hate to break it to them, but their use cases and what they're trying to do, really isn't special, and they could absolutely move over to a standard. And someone may or may not stick up within the organization and say, no, we're going to do it the standard way. Or someone may say, okay, yeah, go ahead, you can do whatever you want. And that becomes this, well, they're the special, they're the special circumstance. And now nothing works, with them because they've gone so far beyond the rails that everything is customization. So getting back more to standards and the basics, I think, helps out a lot of organizations get out of that stuck and being in that rut, of too much specialness that really isn't warranted.
Yeah, and people make career decisions, right? And so for them to make a change, a lot of people think that's a slap about their decision, or it's an impediment to their furtherance of their career. And you get a lot of, this is the 8th layer of the ISO stack, right? You get into politics and things like that, and it's difficult sometimes to make these changes. But like I said, let's see if we can persevere and move forward.
Another thing that I see a lot, I think, with what you're bringing up, Jackson, around the platform. Platform is the center. The platform is the killer app.
Yeah.
So the platforms that come to mind for me, you mentioned ServiceNow. Salesforce is the other one that I see as being the big. And both of those platforms now have identity management options. We'll just call them options, right? So if your organization feels that platform is where you want to be, then extending into those IAM options can make sense. But you have to, that's the decision that has to be made first, is like, we want that platform, especially when it comes to Salesforce. In other words, we're going to be a Salesforce shop. We're going to build our applications at Salesforce. And we'll go to a best of breed as the exception case. But first choice is, can we use Salesforce to do that? If the answer is, if that is your strategy, is around using the platform, then I think that you should look at IAM in the same way. Can we achieve what we want to achieve with the IAM tools in that platform, or partners of that platform, et cetera? If you're going with a full best of breed model, especially right now I'm talking customer IAM, or I'm thinking customer IAM, going with the best of breed model, I think then you also have to take a best of breed approach to IAM, which doesn't mean that you don't look at, say, Salesforce IAM, but you don't give it necessarily the Salesforce first approach. It's an option, just like the other tools, like I was about to say Obelix, but you might want to look at, say Okta or Ping or ForgeRock, et cetera, on equal footing.
No, I hear you. And we went through that phase of the argument of the suite versus the singular tool to solve a singular problem a number of years ago, and I think that's still a valid argument to have. But I do truly believe in the platform. You just have to look at Azure and what they've done, what Microsoft has done around Azure and the platform around that, and all the underpinnings that they're building into Azure. AWS or Amazon and AWS to some degree is similar, and you mentioned both ServiceNow and Salesforce, who I think are up and comers on at least on the identity side too. So I do think in the long run, all of those options will become more hard to overcome because people invest millions and millions of dollars in those four platforms, and we're going through vendor consolidation, we're going through remote workforce stuff with COVID now, and there are a lot of reasons why when companies have spent that kind of money on either of those four platforms, why they would want to further spend money and cement them in with other things that are sort of around the edge, like identity and access management or governance, at least in my opinion. We'll see if it happens, but that's kind of the way I feel about it.
Let me throw another curveball kind of question at you. So
Yeah.
do you ever find that, we used to always do these buy versus build analysis, and they kind of got out of vogue because it's like, why would you ever want to build it? But more recently, I've been having a lot of customers ask for a buy versus build analysis, especially when it comes to customer IAM. Do you ever feel there's a scenario where build actually does make more sense?
Well, so the answer is yes, and I'll give you kind of the two things that pop in my mind. The first one being, sometimes you're at the leading edge of a problem, and nobody in the industry, in the commercial side of the world, has picked up on it yet. And one great book, and I highly recommend it to folks. I mean, I think a lot of people have read it, but if you've read Walter Isaacson's book about Steve Jobs, his biography, one of the points somebody said was, well, how many customers did you talk to when you were, building and designing and thinking about the iPhone? And he said, none. Customers don't know what they want until you show it to them. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty amazing statement. And in some ways, a lot of these problems, like IAM, didn't start as an IAM problem. It became, the industry became IAM. So one thing is, I think sometimes, build makes sense in that particular case. The other thing where it makes sense is where, if we just talk about platform for a second, if you think about CIAM, customer IAM, there are many companies out there that specialize pretty much solely in customer IAM. But if you look at something from a platform perspective, you look like at an Amazon, or you look at Azure with their B2C offering, you could leverage the platform and all the capabilities of one of those platforms, and in quotes, build some of the specialized UI you might need, or some of the specialized back-end things that you want to implement, but still leverage the platform. So it's not really buying, it's not really building the whole thing. It's it's spending money on part of it. And I think a lot of people are missing that point. They think that might be all about buying or building themselves. But you look at something like Azure and how scalable it is, and the fact they've got a B2C offering, or AWS and how their stuff scales. Why not build a CIAM platform on top of that? And there are some companies that have done that, and then there are some companies also that just totally specialize in CIAM, and you could have a discussion about which is better, which I would say is probably based on the circumstances of the particular company that's buying. But you get into that whole thing again, like if we just talk for one more second about platform, you get into the whole thing. Can I find someone who understands Azure or AWS and DevOps around those things, and security around those things, and this particular feature or module, or that particular feature or module, versus somebody who's going with a vendor who only specializes in CIAM and they're not a platform vendor? I would say that I could find more partners that know Azure or AWS. I could find more people who've been trained and have got the certifications on those things than on some other company that specializes in this. So I think that the buy versus build is really interesting. It's definitely build when you're at the very start of a problem. Like, I'll give you an example. I don't know if companies are doing this, but one thing I've been thinking a lot about where there's a lot of problems is the security differences, the impedance mismatch between security in AWS, Azure, rack space, and all these different things that are built on top of these platforms. Like, how do you make sure that Jackson's files in Google and in OneDrive and in iCloud Drive, et cetera, all of the right security. How do we manage this, the confidentiality of files? Because I might be storing, a company file or financial data on one of these different systems. Like that to me is a very, very difficult problem. Do I want to, and I've seen companies who have built solutions to help solve that. But is that something that they should be doing? It's really, really tough. So that's like, for an example, something where I would hope that somebody in the commercial world would come out and say, okay, I've got a product that's going to do that. Maybe they've got that now. I don't know. I haven't looked at that in the last, say, year or so. But I think some things you have to, when you've got these kind of problems, you do have to build. But I think there's a lot of reasons why I would rather want to buy first if I could, and on a platform, buy a platform.
Well, I think part of it too is, the organizations need to figure out what business they want to be in, right? Do they really want to be a software developer, right? If you're baking bread and that's your business, why would you want to take that on?
If it's not your core business, you got to think really seriously about why you got to do it. There's got a huge advantage to you for doing something like that. And sometimes it's, those problems get solved by a company, and that those people who solved it spin out and create the commercial product that solves that problem. And you know what? That's awesome when that happens.
I know we're coming up here at the end of our time, and you've certainly been gracious with it. So Jim and I both appreciate it, as well as our listeners.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, what are things that people who are in the IAM space can do? Read, watch, listen to, whatever. I mean, obviously, other than this amazing podcast that we have.
Well, this is number one,
right? So number two, what are some things that you could give maybe to people who are listening to help them educate themselves in the space or just get better?
Well, look, I think folks that have been in this business know about companies like Gartner and Forrester, and they've got either smart people, or they've got the Gartner IAM conference, the Gartner Catalyst, which is, I talked about Catalyst. It was the Burton Group, and they got bought by Gartner. Amazing conferences to go to, but, thousands of people. Smaller conferences that I think are really super, and the reason I think they're really super is because you run into, or you can meet and walk up to the cognoscenti of the identity and access management world. Kuppinger Cole has an identity conference, and Kuppinger, I'll just spell it Kuppinger, Cole, Cole. They've got a YouTube channel. They've got a CIAM conference. They've got a security conference. They're relatively small, and pretty much the industry luminaries or major folks, major players go to those. I went to the Kuppinger Identity Conference for years and years and years. Another one I'll mention is the Identiverse Conference, another really important conference, or great conference to go to. Gary Rowe, who is an old friend of mine, I'll put a plug in for him. He used to be at Gartner. He's created a company called Tech Vision. They're wonderful. I like to ask people sometimes what books they're reading, and I'll just mention a couple that have been very helpful for me. When I was at Microsoft, I did not know how much I would end up doing public speaking and everything, but one of the best books I read was a book called Power Presentations by Jerry Wiseman, Weissman, just about how to do presentations and how to present yourself and how to build good PowerPoint decks if you're doing PowerPoint like I did and still do. It's just a great resource. And if you work with people, there's a great book I just finished called Surrounded by Idiots by a guy named Thomas Erikson, Erikson. And, one of the things I learned was that people are different in the way they communicate and absorb things. And Surrounded by Idiots is all about teaching you about the folks that are around you and how to teach or speak to them in the language that they need to hear you, so there's not an impedance mismatch, which is really cool. It was very helpful for me in many ways. And one or two last books that I'll just mention, really good if you're interested in how Netflix rose to its greatness and the people behind it. Patty McCord wrote a book called Powerful. I saw her present and talk about that and was just amazed by it. And another one by Patrick Lencioni called Death by Meeting, which is all about doing meetings in a Scrum methodology, 5 minutes, 10 minutes kind of thing, where you do roundtables real quick, basically stand-ups, which is pretty cool. So I think there's some books I'm reading. The ID Pro alliance of people who are all about identity management professionals is pretty good too. And the Coopinger Cole, Tech Vision, Gartner, Forrester. If you haven't heard about Magic Quadrants, then you definitely haven't gone to a Gartner conference or you haven't spent enough time on Gartner. And then of course Identiverse. That's my main places where I go to learn the cool stuff that's happening around identity and access management.
Yeah, I think Jim and I we're both big fans of Identiverse, and that's where ID Pro spun out of. So I'm a member of that as well, and I serve on the nominating committee for the board, which is very cool. Kind of get to see how that works.
Awesome. I have not been to an Identiverse conference in a few years, mainly because just the companies that I've been with have not been participating in them. But when and if we ever get back to traveling and going to conferences in person, I plan on being at the next one. So,
well, I think it's easier now than ever, right? With all the different methods of ways to get information. You've got YouTube, you've got all the websites.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's so much easier than it used to be, right? To get up to speed on things. And, you can find a 5-minute YouTube, primer video on, SAML, right? And okay.
Oh, I know. It's amazing.
You're not looking to be an expert. That's a great way to just at least know what it is, right?
Yeah. And just last thing about Coopinger Cole and their YouTube channel, which I was on just a couple of nights ago, they recorded a lot of their keynote sessions and a lot of their great sessions at their different conferences over time. So you can go in and you can see a guy like Kim Cameron talking about the future of identity and just play that, or other folks. And I think to your point, YouTube is just an amazing tool for that. And when it comes to being able to communicate that kind of information, especially in shorter sound bites, it's awesome. And as professionals, we should all use it more. So yeah, it's a great way to find out anything, to be honest.
Well, that's great. I appreciate it. And we'll try to put some of the links to some of those things. I know people may be trying to furiously jot those down as I was and failing. And, we'll get those into the show notes so that people could reference them there. And, Jackson, this was a great conversation. Really appreciate you spending the time with Jim and myself. Is there anything that you want to kind of close with before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, you can follow me. I'll just plug myself. I mean, not that I'm really plugging myself, but, I am on Twitter, Jackson Shaw. LinkedIn, if you want to connect with me, Jay Shaw is my ID on LinkedIn. And, I'm happy to, help people. I mean, biggest part of being, kind of my age and where I am in my career is I love helping people and giving guidance. And, if you want to bounce ideas or just ask questions, feel free, and I'll, happy to pass you guys some of the, the notes about these places I mentioned. But I just wish everybody luck. And, there's a lot of great people out there that want to help you, that have been in this business for a while. So, and I appreciate the fact that you guys are bringing a lot of those people on. And, it's a great business to be in. I mean, there's nothing better, at least for me personally, to solve a company's problems and help them be better. And just make them successful. I mean, my boss at Zoomit, when I asked him, what am I supposed to really do here? And he said to me something I've never forgotten: help your customer get promoted. Yep. And if we all think that way, we'll be successful.
Yep. It's definitely a fraternity, right? Or whatever word we want to use, of all the people in IAM space. And, we're built on the shoulders of the people who came before us. And, the people who are rising up in the ranks now, right? They're the ones who have, who knows, their Active Directory might have already been replaced, and exactly. We just don't know it yet.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
words of wisdom from the IAM Jedi.
Thank
all
you.
Right.
Guys.
So I appreciate it, Jackson. So thanks for listening, everybody. You can catch us at identityatthecenter.com. And with that, we're going to go ahead and leave it for you, and we'll talk to you in the next one. Thanks. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.